Have you ever stopped to consider how often you hear a version of the phrase, "Dude, you're cheesing me"? Be it referring to an imagined PvP scenario in Dark Souls, Fox versus Fox, no items on Final Destination, or a duel outside of Orgrimmar City. While the meme format itself is an attempt to poke fun at the crowd of gamers who consider themselves more hardcore adjacent, for lack of better wording, their mere existence belies the reality that a lot of us are in some way guilty of the same sort of thinking. While most of us will rightfully laugh at anyone who would dismiss a loss as bullshit simply because it didn't take place on Final Destination, be it because of the innate ridiculousness or the fact that Fox versus Fox has never been how any melee competition is evaluated. Can we say the same thing for any and all other imagined scenarios, though? Someone only playing the strongest characters games have to offer. A player only exploiting the strongest possible builds in an ARPG. Cannon rushing in StarCraft. Button mashing in Tekken. Only throwing fireballs in Street Fighter. Or daring to use magic in a Souls game. There are countless of these imposed restrictions or soft rules that we as players and communities create around our chosen games. Hell, it's not even relegated to video games. In real-life sports, you have techniques like granny throwing that are allowed, but definitely not promoted. Similarly, these video game techniques or strategies are allowed, but at the same time very much frowned upon. It doesn't seem to matter in what setting they are employed either. Be it multiplayer or single player, a large crowd of people will react strongly to players cheapening the gameplay and not experiencing the real game. And here we arrive at last, the real game, the final bastion of defense in the honest gamer's arsenal. If one skill isn't enough to carry one over the finish line, at least one can rest easy in the bosom of moral superiority. Or maybe scratch that last part. It's not even relegated to the idea of ethics. I mean, if someone isn't partaking in the experience of the real game, then any display of supposed skill is easily falsified. But sure, they're probably a scumbag as well, or at the very least a little bit deluded. The idea of the real game as a pitfall is hardly a novel one. Plenty of people have attempted to battle the concept over the years. From speedrunners defending the complexity of their game's routes, to David Sirlin and Seth Killian deconstructing the terminology in their seminal works Playing to Win and Domination 101. The sad fact, however, is that as the years drag on, it seems like this sort of thinking is on the uptake within our diverse and plentiful communities. So while this essay and its messaging might come across as a bit repetitive and at times downright trite, do remember that if you are familiar with these ideas, then it was probably not aimed at you. As a final addition, my area of expertise lies firmly within the sphere of fighting games. And it is through this lens that we will primarily be exploring the territory of this real game. I will, however, attempt to not get lost in the nitty-gritty, and it is my belief that the ideas touched upon will largely be entirely game agnostic and easily applicable to other genres. Before we begin in earnest, perhaps a quick refresher on what the real game practically implies is in order. Verbose intros aside, an attempt at a succinct definition will be useful moving forward. The term real game is, funnily enough, entirely contradictory to its actual meaning. Consider the unadulterated set of parameters of any one specific game system. Be that an RTS, an RPG, or a fighting game. The set of parameters in question is all-inclusive. For example, in the RTS, this would include all the factions, the maps, the building options, the units that these buildings produce, and the set of commands one could order any one unit to execute. On top of these core and very uncontroversial parameters, we have a set of extra ones in glitches and exploits possible within the game system. These parameters are what form the game. In short, it's really just any possible action within this specified system. The real game, on the other hand, is a sort of ghostly parameter that floats outside of the system. A transparent command that parasitically attaches itself to an already existing one. In the case of the RTS, a real game parameter of Zerg rushing is not allowed might attach itself to the existing game parameter of the Zergling as a buildable unit. This new parameter, being transparent, cannot directly influence the core parameters of the game. It merely exists as an opinion on what constitutes a real display of skill. Unlike a true game parameter, which is immutable, that is to say that whatever feelings you might harbor towards the Zergling as a unit, at the end of the day, it still exists within the system. The real game parameter, though, is as easy to reject as it is to embrace. In short, the real game is a set of personal parameters or rules that sit on top of already existing ones and modify what a player might consider acceptable. Often enough, a person will utter a version of the phrase, "You aren't playing the real game," as an accompaniment to their highlighting a personal parameter. Often is not synonymous with always, however, and there exist a large number of permutations and more or less cleverly hidden phrasings that might be used to hide a real game parameter. Intentional or not, eloquently put or sloppily presented, if examined, these statements all contain the same easily dismissible arguments. If the idea of the real game still seems hard to grasp, worry not, as we will look over some oft-recurring real game parameters. Some that might be familiar, and others that might feel altogether fresh. Throws are notoriously strong in the second iteration of the Street Fighter series, executing in 1/60th of a second if close enough, and entirely lacking a bespoke whiffing animation. On top of this, unlike in later games, all regular throws in Street Fighter 2 can never be entirely negated by a throw break, only softened for reduced damage, and even this is version specific. This has led to a recurring real game parameter where throwing has been considered a cheap strategy by a large number of players. Never strictly banned from play, but discouraged as a dishonorable strategy. For a more modern example, we can turn our gaze towards From Software's critical darling, Elden Ring, where the option of using magic is for the first time in the Souls series a truly competitive option to swinging your sword around. This, being a very recent phenomenon in a long-running series, means a real game parameter has attached itself to what is considered the canon gameplay loop. In most players' minds, the core identity of the Souls games as a series is rolling through boss attacks and hitting R1 once or twice in retaliation. Elden Ring equips magic users with a breadth of new and very strong options that allow them to easily dispatch some enemies in a way quite different to this imagined core loop. A result of this is that a large amount of the community decries magic as cheapening the experience and not representing a real win over the game's adversaries. Another instance of an interaction interfering with what parts of a community consider a game's core philosophy is present within Nintendo's classic Super Smash Bros. Melee, where utilizing the game's universal evasive mechanic, air dodge, in conjunction with the jump, allows players to rapidly slide across the stage. A combination that practically unlocks a new movement mechanic for players who invest the time to master it. Many players of the series consider this an exploit of the game's intentional design and an option that stands diametrically opposed to the intention of the game's creators. A real game parameter has been attached to the air dodge that limits the allowed utilization of the mechanic. Taking another glance at Melee, one might consider the entire idea of real game parameters somewhat unfeasible as a basis of critique. After all, the majority of competitive play within the Smash series as a whole is accompanied by a slew of rule sets, banning stages, items, and sometimes even characters. It is important to distinguish a real game parameter from community-created rule sets employed in specific environments. A tournament-aimed rule set that clearly lays out that utilizing certain options, say items in Smash, is not allowed beforehand, is not the same thing as a real game parameter. In a practical sense, a rule set employed by a tournament organizer creates a new version of said game. The options that are banned either literally being turned off and inaccessible, or simulated as inaccessible by disqualification upon use. Banning Meta Knight essentially creates a new version of the game lacking the game parameter Meta Knight. In comparison, allowing Meta Knight, but feeling like players utilizing the character aren't actually competing for real, creates a real game parameter attached to the character. It is easy to look at discussions centered around the real game and come to a conclusion that it only affects players on the lower end of the skill ladder. That getting good will inevitably lead to an abandonment of the somewhat oxymoronic stance that allowing something to be used, but complaining about its usage entails. That conclusion would be quite drastically off base, however, since real game parameters are entirely subjective and on top of that, generally completely value-based. A combination that allows players of all calibers to hold extremely similar views. For an example of this, we can take a look at the Tekken series, where an oft-recurring low-level real game parameter is that players who pick the Taekwondo-based character Hwoarang aren't actually playing Tekken. This view is primarily based in Hwoarang having very strong knowledge-based offensive capabilities, allowing players to steamroll opponents in the lower levels of play without investing as much time in quote-unquote general skills as opposed to Hwoarang skills. This is a view that the majority of highly skilled Tekken players stand opposed to, arguing that not only is Hwoarang a core and recurring character within the series, but also a character that plays just as much Tekken as the rest of the cast, once people learn how to properly defend versus him. On the flip side of this, if asked, a similarly large number of Tekken 7 top players do not consider Akuma and Geese, guests from 2D game series, as playing real Tekken. Crucially, however, the argument for this is basically identical to the one employed for Hwoarang. The same real game parameter is in play, and it is actually one that is extremely recurring within fighting games as a whole. Consider this statement. Being good with a character does not mean you are good at the game. For a recent example of this, we can look at a live stream by veteran Guilty Gear competitor Romola. A stream that I would say generally contains some pretty decent advice, but also one that propagates a noticeable amount of real game adjacent opinions. Possibly only because of very poor wording, but that is hard to ascertain without being able to peer into Romola's brain. That is to say, there's a lot of decent advice hidden within that short video, but it is buried under levels of real game nonsense that plagues so many creators within the gaming sphere. Ostensibly, the video can be summarized as Romola telling the story of a player who spent all their time playing one very specialized character in a overtly strong way. She then points out that if said character or strategy was no longer available, the player in question would suddenly see their results dwindle to nothing. If they had instead committed their time to learn more characters, then that could have been avoided. The end. If investigated, it seems that the broader topic the essay discusses is the idea of overcommitting to certain ways of playing and the possible pitfalls said idea entails. When one stops to consider that for a bit, it inevitably ends up feeling somewhat disconnected from the idea of only playing a single character and relying on less generalized tools. For one, it's easy to imagine how a player could be really amazing at one specific thing, say reading their opponent, and in that way increasingly become reliant on what most would consider gamble-heavy strategies. A specialized way of playing that could be considered entirely character agnostic. On top of that, if what a player is doing is working, ought they stop doing said thing? Granted, we do live in a world where patching means that your strategy of choice might change at a moment's notice, which means that learning how to pilot your character without their strongest tool could end up being a good investment. However, is this not an idea that ought to then be brought up within the essay that discusses it? And even with that debatably fringe potential drawback, one could just as easily argue that it is potentially a waste of time to practice scenarios that might not ever be useful in actual play. Even more pressing is the oft-recurring thought that seems to spring up from these sort of discussions, where being good at a lot of things, e.g. being fundamentally strong or knowing how to play more characters, is seen as an objectively gooder good than being good at some specific things, e.g. being a character specialist. This seems to ring true even if both players produce identical results, where the lots of things good is seen as superior and more real than the specialized one. It might come as a surprise to some players, but competitive games actually only have one way to determine the effectiveness of these goods, namely, winning. Anything that produces results is objectively good at winning, and anything that doesn't is objectively less good. Now, if one is to be charitable, then perhaps the larger issue at hand that is trying to wrest its way free from this somewhat murky wordage is the idea of consistency. If one spends all their time on practicing recurring core structures within their game system, for fighting games this could be strong poking, blocking, punishing, anti-airing and the like, then they will presumably end up with a skill set that is more easily interchangeable between characters and titles. But that is, in my experience, not the sort of discourse that flows out of these essays, nor is it necessarily even what players are interested in generally, which I suppose might play a part in the discourse becoming what it becomes. For a real-world comparison, imagine two ice hockey professionals. One is an incredible all-rounder. They are quick and nimble on their skates, great at communicating with their teammates, tricky to lock down, and can definitely make shots when called for. On the other hand, we have a player who is almost stationary because of their terrible skating skills. They have pretty poor game sense and are bad at keeping the puck when bullied. However, if they go for a shot, regardless of where they're positioned on the rink, they score 100% of the time. Player number one is undoubtedly the more well-rounded of the pair. Crucially, however, if the scoring ends up in the favor of player two, regardless of the amounts of fumbles or misplays, then player two is objectively better at hockey. It might not feel like they are playing the real game, and maybe their skill set is more volatile in the case of a change in the league's rule set, but they are objectively stronger at the current game. It is important to not confuse the claim being presented as being extremely strong at a subset of the skills within the game system isn't equal to being a strong player. Say, being good at doing combos does not equal being good at the overall game. That is logically sound and coherent. Nor is it the equally reasonable claim that a player who is specialized in one thing could reasonably become even stronger if they also strengthen the weaker aspect of their skill sets. Plainly put, the claim is as follows. Results gained with said specialized strategy is of less value than identical results gained with strategies based in the real game. This can, as we have seen with the above-mentioned example featuring Ramallah, intentionally or not be baked into a slew of practically applicable advice and in that way be lent more credence. It is hard to accurately gauge how much of an impact real game messaging from influencers has on players, be it hidden or overtly communicated, but I doubt it helps beginners refrain from reaching for the ever so near at hand coping mechanism of real game excuses. I mean, how often do you hear a version of the phrase, "If they played another character, they definitely wouldn't be doing as well"? A sentence that is, when deconstructed, identical to saying you would win less if you were made worse at the game, something that is self-evident, but hardly very damning. There is an interesting contrast within real game politics in that they seldomly adhere to any one specific stance or view. The "you are only good with your character" is a real game claim that stands agnostic to results produced while playing. That is to say, the strategy employed to gain results is what matters, not the results themselves. In comparison, another recurring real game claim seems to lay its focus entirely on the results of a selection of players and the strategies they use. We can again look to a Ramallah video, titled "The Consequence of Loose Fighting Games" for an example of this. Here we can specifically highlight a section where she speaks about two legacy attacks which have been removed in the latest iteration of Guilty Gear, namely Kai's Greed Sever and Saul's Riot Stomp. Ramallah being of the mind that this change is objectively positive, seeing as the attacks in questions are ones that ought to go because of their complete uselessness. The argument behind this being that they are moves that poorly communicate their true function, a phrase eerily reminiscent of the real game, don't you think? And that they teach players to play the game the wrong way. There it is again. Specifically, Ramallah argues that their intended use case is one of going over the opponent's attack, and not to be used as a mix-up tool or way to begin offense. The wrong way in this instance is possibly best summarized as a strategy that doesn't entirely focus on resilient and recurrently effective tactics, especially ones that could be described as mitigating risk. As with the earlier example, there's certainly some truth to this statement. Along with the truth of the matter comes some odd opinions presented as objective truths, however. For one, it's pretty doubtful that you could realistically describe those moves as truly useless in their non-intended use case, even at the absolute highest level of play. You definitely still see objectively terrible moves get used, albeit rarely, in other titles, even from top players in high-stakes settings. Secondly, not every player is interested in playing the quote-unquote correct way. The solution of stripping the game down to only containing the tools that form the bulk of the top-level strategy would, without a doubt, have us end up with games that the majority of players found more dull to play. Even if it were true that the moves in question did end up hindering some number of players from moving on to more risk-averse play, it is a leap to state that this potential harm outweighs the more objective harm of reducing the fun for, presumably, more players. The players that do want to rely less on these moves still have the option to do so in a game that contains them, while the reverse cannot be said to be true. Thirdly, even if one were to concede to the idea that these moves were effectively useless in top-level play, that wouldn't necessarily mean that they had no value for the real game. One could quite easily make the argument that these sorts of moves still represent objectives for players to overcome as they level up and become stronger. Real, tangible goalposts of progress that overtly teach one of the most important lessons to win more within fighting games. Do the things that work, not the things that people say are good or bad. Having lower level play look and feel different to higher levels of play is almost impossible to avoid. And is that something one should even consider a strictly bad thing? It, as mentioned before, can give a player a feel for how they are progressing along the game's skill ladder. At this point, it is worth noting that it is true that risk mitigation is something that almost inevitably occurs as one becomes a stronger player, and is often accomplished by eliminating certain tactics from one's strategy, be they based in offense or defense. Adopting a view of not utilizing riskier strategies from the get-go might have a player develop at a quicker rate than one that does not. But one needs to bear in mind that loads and loads of players aren't willing to value risk mitigation over other parts of the experience that they enjoy, and that does not mean they are not playing correctly. This is true even for very strong players. There are any number of examples one could show of players opting for flashier or needlessly mechanically complex tactics in their playstyle, But one very easy way to illustrate this is to simply consider the fact that lots of players will opt out of playing top or even mid-tier characters, an idea that is pretty much anathema to what Ramallah is de facto describing as the right way to play. Playing the real game then is in this case doing whatever maximizes your odds at winning, and these players are at times significantly swinging the odds against them even before they get into the match. How odd. But maybe these two separate instances of real game claims are in actuality branching out from the same core concept. Instead of thinking of these as having to do with coping with results or effectively being wrangled as lies to children, one could instead look at the real game as a consequence of a game's implied aesthetic. This aesthetic, or soul of the game for lack of better wording, acting as a community-created gestalt. If seen from this lens, one is at least lent an explanation as to why the expectations of what the real game entails is seldomly consistent across titles. Consider a comparison between the aesthetic qualities, or gestalt, of the Tekken series as opposed to that of the Marvel vs. Capcom games. In the former of these, the gestalt of the real game is almost intrinsically tied to doing less. To play the real game of Tekken is to be almost entirely agnostic to strategies tied to a specific character, or even a specific set of moves. This certainly lends some explanatory aid as to why some, at this point decades-long veteran characters to the series, are still seen as gimmicky options. That's just short for not really playing the game, if you didn't catch it. In this gestalt, the contents of the real game can be approximated as utilizing as few unique elements as possible and relying heavily on the game's shared movement system for your wins, a recurring opinion across the game's skill progression. In the latter, the gestalt of the real game is possibly best described as anything goes. The Marvel series has a long-standing history of metagames centered around easily replicatable glitches and mechanical workarounds. When added on top of the game's already frantic pace and bombastic visuals, not to mention the series' incredible roster of personalities, it is easy to see why these games has always stood as such a spectacle within the fighting game community. In the case of Marvel, holding the opinion that players who lean more heavily on character agnostic and risk mitigating strategies to be more real is very rare. On the contrary, many of the strategies within the Marvel series that slow down match pace and seem, at least on the surface level, to opt for a more methodical approach tend to be seen as lame. A set of opinions that seem to trickle down and inform most people's view of the series as a whole. The manifested gestalt of Marvel is one of that crazy game, so opinions on the real game follow along a similar trajectory. Either way you slice it, the idea of the real game has the same fatal flaw. It is, just as the pirate code before it,
More what you call guidelines than actual rules.
the real game is really just a cruel and wicked trick to play on people. One that allows them the option to pick whatever they want, but never forgets to ridicule them for making the wrong choice. Evaluating the concept lends more and more credence to strictly applied rule sets with limitations and outright bans. It would be ludicrous of me to argue that a competitive community at its core has no right to value certain aesthetic qualities. There are no inherent evils to a majority of players codifying what specific skills they feel are the ones that ought to be tested. As stated earlier, a new rule set practically creates an entirely new game. A game where it is impossible for a player to engage in taboo ways of playing, since those options for any practical purpose have ceased to exist. Furthermore, a rule set is clearly defined and lets a player truly evaluate if they have any interest in the system that has been created from the get-go. A player entering into a world of an already established rule set will seldomly long for options that have been cut from it. Just look at a game like Melee, where 80% of all stages are banned from competitive play, not to mention the entire mechanic of items. Now, you can argue back and forth all you want if this makes it a better game. Though I can't really say I've heard anyone bemoan the fact that they can't play on Brimstar depths. You cannot, however, argue that it isn't fair. The community doesn't allow items and then trash talk players who use them, they outright ban them from use. Simply because they end up testing a skill, the community has less majority interest in testing. Now, does this mean there are no pitfalls when it comes to the idea of limiting or outright banning strategies available in your game system? Absolutely not. Creating rule sets come with their own hurdles and challenges. Hurdles that, even if generally overcome, will inevitably lead to a portion of the player base being disappointed. Perhaps even leaving the community. Creating systems that promote the majority opinion while not simultaneously crushing and excluding a minority section of one's community is always going to be difficult. But the outcome is, at least, regardless of what it entails, absolutely fair. In Elden Ring, a community of players have banded together to create a Duelers League, a grassroots competitive 1v1 PvP ladder for the game's multiplayer. Along with this ladder comes a hefty set of rules. A set of rules that bars usage of an incredible amount of the game's available arsenal, either because they are deemed to be too strong or not fun to play with and against. Now, contrast the idea of that close-knit group who have in essence created their own multiplayer game within Elden Ring, with the droves of people who expect players to conform to their loosely formed real game parameters out in the open world. The former is technically a more open system to all players. Everything is allowed, but not really. While the second will bar you from even entering if you do not conform to their rule set. The freedom of the first option is, however, intrinsically tied to verbal and psychological abuse that accompanies any real game opinion. I've talked in the past about experiences of people utilizing characters and strategies that are looked down upon by their respective communities. How some people are berated for just showing up to play, while others are basically soft banned from playing and having most of their community members in their area refuse to play them at all. Sure, for some players, acting as the villain is a fun role to play. But that is hardly a universal opinion, nor is it one that is very thrilling to inhabit unless you're actually winning a lot. Someone might be okay with playing the part of Skeletor, but nobody wants to be Beastman. At the end of the day, I usually leave you, the audience, with no clear-cut answer to the proposed problem. And that's exactly what I'm going to do again. I wish it was as easy as telling people to stop acting like bullies because people enjoy something they don't, but that's hardly a very compelling argument. Maybe we can all be a bit more critical to the language and messaging we hear from people all around us. And if we are absolutely, definitely certain we cannot live with the strategy being employed in our games, petition to change the rule set instead of bullying those who practice it.